Well, if you're going to hush, then I guess that means I should stand up and say something. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Tanya Ha. I'm delighted to be your host and facilitator tonight. But before I go into more detail, I really want to, on behalf of the Coral CRC, want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the waters in which we meet, the lands of the Gadigal people. We'd like to acknowledge, pay our respect to their owners, their custodians, their elders, past and present, and acknowledge any members of the Gadigal and other Indigenous communities that are among us tonight. And I think especially at events like this, that are both science events and climate change and environment events, it takes on a greater meaning, because I think the people who are interested in these subjects understand that in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands, we're acknowledging people who have learnt to live sustainably in this harsh sunburnt country for 60,000 plus years of continuous culture. They're Australia's first scientists, Australia's first engineers, and I think that there is so much that we can learn from the traditional owners of these lands. My name is Tanya Ha. I'm a science journalist. You might know me from shows as ABC's Catalyst, but more recently I'm Director of Engagement at Science in Public, a science communications agency, and I'm also an Associate of Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute and on the leadership group of Science and Technology Australia. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all, and welcome back to those who've been here during the day for the symposium. And tonight, what we're going to look at is we're going to ask a panel of experts, what do Australians really need to know about climate change? So for you people in the room, and for people, hello, who are watching via live stream online, this is your chance to pick some really good brains here. So on the stage just behind me, there are people who represent a wealth of knowledge about the topics we're going to be discussing tonight. So if you have a burning question that you would like to ask of the panellists, it can be of them in general, or you can specify a particular person, then you can send in your questions via devices through an app called Slido. So go to www.sli.do and use the event code #Coral2019. Now, for those of you who have your phones out and you're going to be submitting your questions, you also might like to tweet and join the conversation online. And we really encourage that, because there are people who couldn't be here tonight who would love to have been here. And I always think that it's great if we can give the opportunity to share the insights from these four great brains that we have on stage with people outside the room. So the hashtag to use in addition to Coral2019 is #ClimateNeed2, the numeral 2. I should have reflected that way. Climate need to know. So you can see that too on the screen as well. So we do encourage you to tweet and share the insights that we'll hear from the panellists today. Now, I'm going to sit down, and by way of introduction, so that you can learn more about the brains that we can pick tonight, we're going to ask each of the speakers as we introduce them to just give a short overview, like about 4 or 5 minutes of the science or their area of expertise with one slide. And that will give you a sense of the topics that they have a particular expertise on. And from there, we'll launch straight into questions and answers. And I'm holding an iPad here, so I've already got Slido open and some questions are already coming through. So enjoy. Join in via the digital medium, since we're in the age of technology, and we'll get started. So, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. I mentioned in acknowledging the traditional owners that they've learnt to live in this harsh Australian environment in the sunburnt country for 60,000 years. And oh, what a coincidence. I'm holding a book in my hand that's called Sunburnt Country, which you can buy and have signed from the author, in the foyer afterwards. So that's my segue into introducing Dr. Joëlle Gergis, she's an award-winning climate scientist and a writer from the Australian National University. And she's an internationally recognised expert on the Australian climate and the author of said book, Sunburnt Country. And she's also one of the lead authors on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, which she's currently working on. She's also a councillor at the Climate Council. So please make Joëlle welcome.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's terrific to see such a great turnout. So, as Tanya said, I'm a climate scientist, and this is the image that I chose to use for my one single slide. And that is to say that Australia is actually the most vulnerable nation in the developed world when it comes to climate change. As you can see from this image, around 77% of Australia is either characterised as arid or semi-arid. So that means that most of the country actually receives less than 500 millimetres of rainfall every year, and some of those areas even less than 250 millimetres per year. So our coastal cities are really in those wet fringing areas along the coast, which houses most of Australia's population. And so we're often referred to as the land of drought and flooding rains, which is true. And that is because of the location where we sit on the planet. So we sit in one of the great subtropical desert belts of the world, and we're surrounded by oceans. So we have influences from the Pacific, the Southern and the Indian Ocean. And that has a bit of a tug of war in terms of the different influences we have on Australian climate. So we're already a very erratic continent when it comes to climate variability and extremes. So that's just a bit of background I wanted to give you in terms of just the 101 of what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change here in Australia. The second thing I wanted to mention is that we know that the land and seas around Australia have warmed by around a degree since 1910, where the Bureau of Meteorology have their official records available. And we know there's actually a human fingerprint on observed temperatures since 1950. So all of the weather and climate we're experiencing right now has a climate change overlay on it. So what is of great interest to the scientific community who work on this in this area is understanding how natural variability is being influenced by these human activities. That's the million-dollar question. And as I said before, so Australia is the most vulnerable nation in the developed world. And what we're concerned about when we're talking about climate change is our climate becoming even more extreme. So I'm sure we're going to hear about this from some of the other panellists. But for instance, we start to see an increase in extreme temperature events. So when we're thinking about the future, we're talking about 50-degree summer temperatures in our capital cities like Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide. We're talking about water scarcity. And we're talking about an increase in fire weather conditions. So, for instance, many of you would have been following the news this year and seen the catastrophic bushfire conditions we experienced in northern New South Wales and Queensland, where we saw the largest subtropical rainforests in the world that are left in the world actually ignite. Now, that's something I didn't expect to see in my lifetime, and I'm sure we're going to hear about other extremes that are unfolding in real time. So that's the thing I really wanted to bring from I guess, the climate science community, is that we have inherent variability that has to do with where we sit in our geographical location on the planet, but our extremes are becoming even more extreme as the planet continues to warm. And if we continue along this business as usual trajectory in terms of our emissions, which we typically see Australia warm by around 4 degrees by the end of the century. So that means parts of the country will in fact become uninhabitable, and we start to see real major implications for our agricultural sectors, our tourism sector, and just basically the way that we live in a country like Australia. So in terms of my final point I want to make is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out a report in October last year, which was looking at the difference between global warming levels of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And basically, there was some good news in that report, believe it or not. What they did say is that it's geophysically feasible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But then they qualified that by saying, but what is missing is global policy. So currently, we need to triple our emission reduction pledges to achieve 2 degrees of global warming and increase it by 5-fold to get to 1.5. That's the scientific scenario we're dealing with right now. So we have a huge challenge ahead of us, and tonight I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But I guess I'm trying to say from the climate science community, we have inherent vulnerabilities to climate change, and it's not all just business as usual, and we've seen it all before because we are the Sunburnt Country. Climate change is actually influencing the fundamental way that Australian climate actually operates. So, and in a country like Australia, we actually have a lot to lose. And maybe that's a good segue into Terry. Thank you.
Thanks, Joëlle. Our second speaker is Professor Terry Hughes. He's the director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. To give it its proper name, I just said Coral COE at the start, didn't I? And our recurrent theme in his studies is the application of new scientific knowledge towards improving the management of marine environments. And he's won all sorts of awards. I've seen here the Prince Albert II of Monaco presented him with the Climate Change Award. But I also noticed that you won, was it a Wellness Trust Award for, basically, heroes, global heroes who are defending science. What was that one called again?
Maddox Prize.
Maddox Prize, yes. So that very much impressed me too. Please make Terry welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I was really fascinated by Joelle's language just then. So you talked a lot about climate extremes. And I think language is really important. I'll get to coral reefs in a moment. Global warming almost sounds cozy, but anthropogenic climate heating is probably a better descriptor. Heat waves, well, we all experience heat waves back to our childhood, but not extremes in temperature that are actually damaging entire ecosystems. And I think we need to change the language. Many people will talk about climate change as being a threat to the Great Barrier Reef or to other Australian ecosystems. But a threat is something you might or might not do in the future. If you threaten to punch me in the nose, it might not even happen. Whereas climate change has been impacting the Great Barrier Reef for more than 2 decades. And now we've seen 4 major coral bleaching events due to extreme temperatures. So the maps behind me show the bleaching footprint due to record-breaking temperatures in 2016, the hottest sea temperatures measured in over a century of records, followed a year later by even hotter temperatures in 2017. So these are real climate extremes, to use Joelle's terminologies. The red dots in those 2 maps are the reefs that bleached the most severely. And the average loss of corals on those red reefs, and there's hundreds of them, was 61% in 2016 and again in 2017. And you can see that the first bleaching event destroyed many corals in the northern third of the Great Barrier Reef, and a year later, the central region of the Great Barrier Reef was equally impacted. The green dots had little or no bleaching and little or no loss of coral. So the silver lining is that 39% of the corals on the red reefs are still alive. They're the tougher ones. And 100% of the corals on the green reefs are still alive. They're the lucky ones, at least so far. So this was a real game changer for the Great Barrier Reef. It's the first back-to-back coral bleaching event we've seen. We're very concerned about the shrinking gap in terms of number of years between one bleaching event and the next one. So globally, on average, coral reefs throughout the tropics have now bleached 3 or 4 times. And the gap between one event and the next is shrinking. In the 1980s, it was 25 years. Since 2010, it's only 6 years. And that's the window of opportunity for the corals to recover. So we're not quite sure yet what the Great Barrier Reef will recover to in coming years, but it certainly won't be recovering to the same mix of corals that we had in 2015 or earlier, before 2015. So we're on uncharted territory. I tell my students everything we thought we knew about how the Great Barrier Reef works is now wrong, and we have to relearn how this altered ecosystem is responding to anthropogenic global heating. I'll make one final point, and that is coral reefs are often described as the canary in the coal mine, the implication being that they're particularly vulnerable ecosystems to global heating, and they're a sort of harbinger of what might happen to tougher ecosystems in the future. And I never use that term because I don't think it's true. And if we look certainly at other marine ecosystems in Australia and elsewhere, kelp beds, mangroves, seagrass meadows, all marine ecosystems and indeed terrestrial ecosystems are responding to the threat of global warming, and we've been measuring it now for a couple of decades. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they were important points you made there, because I know that coral tends to get the attention because it's so iconic for Australia, but mangrove wetlands and that sort of thing, like they're huge carbon sinks, aren't they?
Yeah, but they're horrible places to work.
Oh, not if you like mosquitoes. Who does? Well, going from sea to land, that's my little segue, bringing in Professor Leslie Hughes. Now, she's a terrestrial ecologist at Macquarie University and an expert on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. She's also a director of WWF Australia, and she's a councillor for the Climate Council, as well as Joëlle. And she's been an author on the UN IPCC reports in the past, and she's an all-round climate change legend. So please make Leslie welcome, and we'll hear from her.
Thanks, Tanya. It's great to go after Terry, because Terry's really introduced coral reefs as an absolute icon of climate impacts in Australia and elsewhere. As a terrestrial ecologist, my focus has been on land mostly, and as Terry said, it's not just corals, it's all sorts of other things. So the first point I'd like to make is that we are seeing, just as we are seeing things like bleaching, seagrasses and mangroves being and kelp beds being damaged in the oceans, we are seeing now really rapid collapse of lots of terrestrial ecosystems in Australia. Joëlle mentioned fires burning into rainforests that have never burnt before. We've had fires in the Tasmanian World Heritage Area burning and killing 1,000-year-old pencil pines. Clearly they have never burnt before. We are seeing in the Murray-Darling, in this unprecedented drought, river red gums dying. You all remember the fish kills from a few months ago, and we're looking at some probably occurring in the next few months. We are seeing impacts on Macquarie Island, which is no longer the lush moss-dominated island that it once was. It's basically covered in brown, dying, disease-ridden mosses. We're also seeing impacts at a species level, mainly from heat waves, but also the combination of heat waves and droughts that are killing eucalypts. And eucalypts are pretty tough old birds, but they are dying in great numbers due to the combination of heat and drought. And then at the other species level, at animals, we are seeing heat waves killing hundreds and probably thousands of individuals. So and this can happen really, really quickly. So one example is the spectacled flying fox from Queensland. It's an endangered species. A third of the entire species dropped dead on a single really hot day a few months back. Similarly, we've seen enormous mortality in things like flying foxes and other bird species, including, incidentally, budgerigars in the outback, which are also really, really tough arid zone species. So we are looking at some restricted species potentially losing an entire species in a really hot day. That's what we're looking at with extremes. So that's all I'll say about ecology, unless I get questions. I think one of the real problems with climate change communication, and there are many, as many of you would be aware, is that climate change is often portrayed only as an environmental problem. And climate change is, of course, a huge environmental problem, but it's not just an environmental problem. It's a problem for our economy. You've just got to look at the impacts of the current drought on agriculture. For probably one of the first times ever, Australia will import wheat this year. Usually wheat is our major agricultural export. We simply haven't grown enough. Similarly, it's a problem for communities and social justice. And I want to end my little... It's really hard to only use one slide. I mean, I'm an academic. I mean, one slide is just cruelty, basically. But I do want to end with a slide that I often use to try to bring home to people, and I'm sure this is not an audience we have to convince, but I'm a former climate commissioner before Mr. Abbott abolished the Climate Commission. When I was on the Climate Commission, we went all over Australia talking to regional audiences in, RSL clubs and literally in town halls and all sorts of other venues. And at the beginning of our town hall meetings, Will, Stefan and I would do a little climate presentation, and you put up a graph like the one I'm showing you there, and you just see half the audience go to sleep immediately, because not many people who are not scientists actually appreciate the power of two-dimensional representations of really scary data. And so I was really puzzling about this, and I thought, you know, this is one of the best and most scary graphs that I've ever come across. It shows the little black wiggly line is the temperature we've had so far. The blue band is the temperature we could get if we meet the Paris Climate Agreement targets, and the red is if we don't, and who knows what would happen. And before one of the Climate Commission town hall meetings, I thought, how can I make this more real to people in an ordinary community audience? So I thought I'd do this. So I'm hoping this works. Do I hit that? Oh, that's the pointer. That one. Okay, so I thought, okay, I'll make this personal. There's me if I live till I'm 85. And that bar is the average temperature that I will experience over that lifetime based on present climate. I've got 2 children. They were born in the mid-90s. And if they live till they're 85, under that business as usual red trajectory, that's the average temperature that they will experience over their lifetime. Now, they don't have children yet, but if they have kids, so my potential grandkids, if my kids have kids when they're about 30 and those grandkids live till they're 85, they will actually live into the next century. And frankly, the next century at the moment is a very, very scary place to think about. That's the average temperature that they could experience over their lifetime. That's not the extremes on a day-to-day basis that Joëlle was talking about. So fundamentally, this is a question of intergenerational equity and social justice, because it's our generation that are creating these problems. The temperatures that we're experiencing right now have been baked into the climate over the last 3 decades or so of emissions, and what we're doing now is the legacy that our kids and our grandkids will have to live with and deal with. So that's my intergenerational equity. I think we have to talk about climate change as an environmental issue, but we also have to talk about it far more broadly than that. Thank you.
So to put it into perspective, that's your kids enjoying their retirement in a world that is 4 degrees warmer on average than it is now. So that's for elderly people who are more vulnerable to heat extremes, that's not a nice thing to envisage. Yeah, I often think about what will my retirement temperature be like, because it is the elderly and the newborns that are most vulnerable to heat stress. Thank you, Leslie. That brings us to our final speaker. We have Simon Holmescourt. He's originally a Silicon Valley type, so came from that sort of background, and he's one of Australia's leading environmental and renewable energy commentators. For those of you on Twitter, you'll see Simon tweeting and saying the things that we want to say, you know, and getting into those arguments that, you know, that I kind of wish I had the courage to, but I try to play nice on Twitter. He's also a senior advisor at the Climate and Energy College of the Energy Transition Hub at the University of Melbourne. And he's also been a pioneering force in the development of community-owned renewable energy in Australia. So he was behind the Hepburn wind project, which is near Daylesford in Victoria, which was unusual because it was one of the first, they had some over in the UK, of community owning being the investors, the shareholders in renewable energy projects. And it's interesting because if you look at wind turbine syndrome, it only occurs in English-speaking countries. It particularly occurs where certain kinds of activists are active in spreading this idea that wind energy might cause illness, and that communities where they derive an income off wind energy don't seem to have wind turbine syndrome. Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, I've got ahead of myself. You should be saying all of this, Simon. Please make Simon welcome.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Great to be here tonight. I'm associated with the Energy Transition Hub, which is a joint project between Melbourne University, ANU, and 3 German universities. And we're studying a whole range of projects looking at the social, economic, and technical challenges and opportunities for the energy transition. It's an absolute pleasure working with the Germans because they haven't gone through the last decade of toxic politicisation and media culture over energy transition. It's been largely bipartisan, and there's just a different and more sophisticated approach to a lot of the questions around energy transition. Germany so far this year has derived 47% of their electricity through renewables, and it's the standout in Europe, having committed to energy transition ultimately about 3 years ago. And they've set themselves a very hard target. They're phasing out coal and nuclear at the same time and moving towards renewable. It's a very tough challenge to lose both, but they're coming through with phenomenal results in their electricity sector. The UK is another standout example where there is bipartisanship. Even through this Brexit period, they're passing. There's been progressive legislation on carbon reduction. Their environmental efforts, or their efforts to reduce carbon, have been completely unimpeded by all of the mess going on in their politics there. And their results, they in their electricity sector, I've got one of the charts up here at the bottom. Renewables overtook thermal, so that's gas and coal, overtook thermal for the first time, and I think it's quite interesting to think that the country that first industrialised with coal is the first country to decouple their economy from coal. In 2012 they set a target to be out of coal by 2025, and it's down to about 2% now. England derives more power from solar than they do from coal. Australia, up the top there, I've got a projection going forward, but I just want to tell you how we've gone. In 2000, we were about 7% renewable. All of that was coming through hydro, and we passed the renewable energy target, which was increased in 2010. By 2010, we had about 10% of our electricity coming from renewables. Last year, we hit 20. So there's an acceleration there, and within 2 years we'll hit 33. So we've gone from 7 to 10 to 20, and within 2 years we'll be up to a third. So with a slow start, we're now accelerating. And just to give you a sense of the acceleration, we installed 12 gigawatts of renewables in the 30 years to 2017. So 12 gigawatts in 30 years, and then in the 3 years to the end of this decade, we're installing that much again. So there's been a massive increase, and so why you might see all the time the politicisation of energy in the political realm and in the media realm. I really want to get across that industry and investors are not sitting around waiting for Canberra to get on with energy transition. All of the new investment in the last decade has gone into renewables, and almost everything going forward, bar for maybe a small amount of gas and probably no more use of gas, is going into the renewable space. At the top there, this is not my fanciful projection of this is, you could call that the death of coal. The blue line there is fossil fuel, and so coal and gas coming down, and the red is renewables going up. This is a scenario run by the energy market operator called AEMO. They ran this scenario last year. It's the most in-depth study we've ever had of Australia's electrical system, I guess. It's no small task for them. They had about 60 or 70 people work in their long-range forecasting. This is not a wish. This is just them playing forward the model of what happens if investors make rational decisions from here on in. So they're not assuming any more policy. This is their business as usual scenario. Now, we all hope that it's a much faster transition, but when you've got a conservative organisation that doesn't have any agenda other than just running the market, and their output is saying that renewables will cross over coal, I think that's quite significant. What's driven this? Firstly, as the costs of renewables have plummeted. So over this decade, solar is now 1/5 the cost it was in 2010, and wind is less than half the cost. The ageing assets, so many people will have heard of Hazelwood that closed. It was 53 years old when it closed. Liddell's about to close at 50. But there are 12 other coal power plants in Australia that closed without anyone noticing when it wasn't as politicised as it is now. They closed because they were too expensive to extend the life of, and what they were replaced. If you look at the energies in the market, they've been replaced with renewable assets. The last thing is policy. Policy does help a lot. So a lot of renewable energy was built under the Renewable Energy Target, and Victoria's renewable energy target and the ACTs have also been significant. But from here on in, most of the development that happens will happen purely as a replacement for old plants that fall over, and with the change in the economics, people aren't maintaining the plants as well as they may have in the past. So we'll see bigger plants like your lawn go out much earlier than people thought. I think while we all get hung up perhaps on the stasis in Canberra or the constant politicisation and culture wars over energy transition, it's one thing that's gone pretty much unnoticed is that every state and territory that make up the Commonwealth has signed up for a net zero by 2050. Now it's only a start, and some of those don't have any plans on how they're going to get there. But every part of the Federation has said that they want net zero by 2050, except for the Commonwealth. So I've talked a lot about the electricity sector. It's only 30% of emissions in Australia. So what about the rest? One thing the Germans are teaching us a lot about is what they call sector coupling. They're well ahead in modelling how this works and beginnings of implementing this. And sector coupling is when we start tying the electrification of other sectors of the economy. So as transport becomes electric, as building heat moves from gas to electric, and industrial processes that might have gas or fossil fuels as an input, as we move them towards either direct electricity or we can make gas like hydrogen or hydrogen derivatives like ammonia, or synthetically produced methane, that's green methane. We can use those. We can use the electricity sector to decarbonise the other sector. And some recent analysis I saw is that 70% of the emissions, 70% of our emissions, now have technologies that are ready and in the market. So we're not waiting for some big breakthrough to address those 70%. There's a lot of people think that we're waiting for some great breakthrough on batteries or some new technology or nuclear or something to be invented. Not the case. We have the technologies right now to reduce emissions by 70%, and clearly we've got to do something about the remainder, but we've got to get on with those. And there are many signs that we are. I just want to quickly talk about where to from there. So there's a lot of fear around, or maybe some exaggeration of concerns around energy transition. One thing I think we need to do a lot more of is talk about the opportunities that come from it. Australia is blessed. We have these windswept plains. That's fantastic for wind generation. We have this Sunburnt Country, which is fantastic for solar. And we have a lot of them, and we have an advanced economy. We're in a great position to take advantage of the energy transition. And there are some clever and accomplished people right now looking at export opportunities for our renewables. How do we export? I'll quickly tell you the three ways. One is running cables to other countries, and while that might sound a bit crazy, there are two startups looking at that. One of them is backed by Mike Cannon-Brookes, and their modelling now shows that they can produce about 20% of Singapore's power can be delivered from Australia on a cable, and it will arrive in Singapore cheaper than the electricity you and I consume at home. So Australian electricity. Another way is hydrogen and derivatives, ammonia and other gases. We can export them as other economies start. And the Germans have told us they've worked out they need a lot of hydrogen, more than they can make with their land mass, and they're very keen to be buying. We're working with them on working out, scoping how much hydrogen they need and whether Australia is a practical source for that. Lastly, another way we can export energy is in energy-intensive goods. So some people have, there's a cute description of aluminium as congealed energy. It takes so much energy to make aluminium that people put the plants next door to wherever energy is cheap. And as Australia produces more and more renewable energy, we can make these energy-intensive goods and export them, export our energy in those finished goods. Lastly, I just want to say, I've noticed a real marked shift in the investment community. I went to a superannuation event today, and there was a funds manager got up and with their portfolio, they benchmark their portfolio now with they give it a global warming potential. So basically, if everyone structured their portfolio like theirs, then it would reach this particular temperature target. They thought they were pretty good investors. They saw that the market as a whole was currently going to deliver a 3.5 or 4 degree world, and they thought their portfolio was much better than average. They found it was 2.8 degree warming, and they've restructured their portfolio. They look at the avoided emissions and the emissions of the portfolio and the avoided emissions, and come up with a temperature rating for that. And they've got their portfolio down to 1.5 degree portfolio. And they're now working with lots of other fund managers to make that a metric. Like instead of the carbon intensity, let's bring it down to a temperature number. And these kind of discussions you just wouldn't have had 5 or 10 years ago. So it's very encouraging to see the investment community is swinging behind this. I'll leave it at that for now.
I think you make some good points there, that those economic arguments and the reliance on investors to think rationally might be a bit more reliable than relying on politicians to think rationally, perhaps. It reminded me actually of someone about 10 years ago, an advisor to the Victorian government was saying, this is going back a bit, the trouble with Victoria's economy, it's quite similar to what you said, is that our 3 top exports are concentrated electricity in the form of aluminium, concentrated water in the form of dairy products, and V8 engine blocks. And that was actually quite prescient, given the way the automotive industries have gone in Australia. So, yeah, food for thought. We have some great questions coming through from you guys. So there's lots of questions, so we'll have to burn through the answers. The second question, I'm saying it's the second question because it's a great question. It's for each of the panellists, so I'm going to ask the first question to give the rest of you time to think. But this great question is to each panellist, what would you do if you were PM? So think about that. While I ask the first question to Terry, what will future reefs look like if we do nothing?
People sometimes mistakenly talk about the death of reefs. Reefs don't die. Corals certainly do, and other heat-sensitive species. So the mix of species is going to change. It's already changing. So we talk about winners and losers in terms of the outcome of a bleaching event. We've seen the effect on the Barrier Reef of just 1 degree of global average warming. We've had 4 bleaching events. If we get to 1.5, then those bleaching events will be more common, more frequent, and probably more severe. But at the same time, what's happening is the mix of species is changing so that they're becoming somewhat tougher. So in 2017, even though the temperatures were higher, it took a lot more heat to produce the same level of bleaching in year 2. And part of the reason was dead corals don't bleach twice, and the ones that were remaining are tougher. So I think if we can constrain global average warming to 1.5, that translates into about 0.4 degrees centigrade of further warming in the tropical ocean. That's doable. We'll still have a Great Barrier Reef. It will still support 65,000 jobs in reef tourism, but it'll be a different system. The mix of species will be different. It will struggle at 2, and if we get to 3, 4, 5, we will have a tropical ecosystem along the east coast of Queensland, but there'll be very few corals on it. It would probably have a lot of seaweed and sponges.
There were a couple of questions that were sort of related, so that I'll weave those in. Can the coral species migrate south? And also, is climate change happening at a pace that's too fast for the species to evolve to adapt to it?
Well, that's two issues. So individual species are moving all over the planet, and they're moving into places that used to be too cold for them. That depends on their mobility. So we're starting to see, and David Booth's in the audience, tropical fish overwinter in Sydney Harbour for the first time. We're seeing individual species migrate on both sides of Australia, and indeed throughout the tropics. Caribbean reefs are moving up along the east coast of the United States. The reefs themselves are not moving because the extension of the Great Barrier Reef into New South Wales is a geological process, and that would take thousands of years, and there's big barriers in terms of too much sand because they need a hard substrate to grow a reef on top of. So we're not going to see the Great Barrier Reef off New South Wales anytime soon. The reefs are responding quickly. The Barrier Reef has just been through one hell of a natural selection event, and we're left with the tougher corals. So we talk about reefs going through a climate gauntlet. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But once temperatures equilibrate, hopefully at something closer to 1.5 than 5, then there'll be a catch-up period where the corals will evolve to whatever that new equilibrium temperature is, and they'll regroup. We may lose some species, and as I said earlier, the proportions of different species will continue to change.
And I'll mention too, for people in the audience who are interested in that, the species distribution and the change. Greta Petzel, you're in the audience here somewhere, aren't you? Yes, she's the brains behind REDMap, which is a citizen science project that is mapping marine species and is particularly interested in how they're shifting. You know, are there sightings of species further south than before? Commercial fishers, recreational divers and ordinary citizens are photographing and mapping their sightings of species. So if that kind of thing interests you, or you know friends who are interested, then redmap.org.au is a place where people can get involved. Hi, Greta. Now, getting back to that, you know, that juicy question of what would each of you do if you were PM? Joëlle, let's start with you. Prime Minister Joëlle Gergis, you know.
Okay. I would firstly declare a climate emergency in this country.
Yeah.
And following on from that, I think that we really do need to improve our scientific literacy as a community. So I would really love to see more people getting engaged in science in whatever way that they can, whether it's through the natural world or various other ways, because it's really important that we start to, as I like to term it, connect the head and the heart. So understanding our physical systems, but then caring about it and feeling something about being custodians on the land in which we live. So I'd really like to see those two things happen, I guess.
I'll go to Leslie now. We'll come back to you last, Terry.
Am I being the Prime Minister, or am I telling Scott Morrison what to do?
You're being the Prime Minister.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say stop wearing those stupid baseball caps, and tell the truth would be good. Thank you. The first thing I would do would be to set up a plan to transition out of fossil fuel subsidies, because the IMF recently calculated that Australia subsidises fossil fuels by $29 billion a year, which is $1,200 for every man, woman and child. So by removing that subsidy, it makes renewables that Simon was talking about even cheaper, and that would be a very practical way to speed the transition up. I would also be talking about new jobs, new manufacturing, the new economy, rather than clinging with my toenails to 18th century forms of energy and 18th century forms of manufacturing, and actually and taking up all of the really exciting positive things that Simon was saying. Those are going to happen. They're all going to happen. They're happening now. In order to save coral reefs and all of the other things around us, including ourselves, they just have to happen much, much faster. So we've just got to speed that transition, the inevitable transition. It's got to go 3 times, 4 times faster.
Simon?
I think one of the first things I'd do is set up a commission to communicate to the public how this is going. I'd call it the Climate Commission, and we have one of those. Council. I would set up an innovation organisation. Let's call it ARENA. We've got one of those. I'd set up a green bank. Let's call it CEFC, and we of course have one of those. I would set up an independent authority to look at to work out what are the trajectories what's the trajectory we need to be on. It's one thing to say net zero by 2050, but at the current rate we're burning through our budget, our carbon budget, I think we've only got about 6 years left before we blow our carbon budget. So the sooner we start reducing, the less steep the trajectory and the less the easier it's going to be to manage. So I would set up an independent authority to do that, and I'd probably call it the Climate Change Authority, which we have, but it's been neutered. So I'd make sure that beef that up again and give it the independence to come up with targets. And then implement market systems, a carbon price, which we used to have, in order to get this moving and leave the innovation to the innovators. But what ARENA could do is focus on the sector coupling and working out how are we going to reduce emissions from agriculture. There are great opportunities in agriculture sequestering carbon, but there are some agricultural processes that are difficult. How we're going to decarbonise cement and steel. People have been working on both of those, but that kind of innovation is high risk, and that's one that the government could get into.
One thing that I thought you might have a perspective on, given that you know renewable energy well, so kind of almost drawing on what Leslie was saying about if I was PM or if I could talk to our PM and convince him. Let's take that angle with you, if you could talk to our PM. He's a marketer, and he was it Tourism Australia or Tourism Queensland?
I've got an idea on that.
It strikes me as a marketing thing, Australia on the world stage, I don't want to be the world's quarry. Should we talk, instead of about renewable energy, talk about, the sunburnt country, Australia, it's a land of sunshine, come here for a holiday and we use that sunshine to produce our electricity. You can go surfing on Australia's coastlines and we also use wave energy to produce our electricity. You can go windsurfing, or you can go Sydney to Hobart yacht race. That wind power goes through the roaring 40s. Come to Australia, etc. Do you think do we need to market it better to the marketer, Prime Minister?
Once again, Australia is a lucky country. Right? In the 19th century, we had gold, massive gold rush. In the 20th century, we had wheat and wool and coal and gas. We were the lucky country then. In the 21st century, when we're carbon constrained, we are once again the lucky country. We have these boundless plains. They're windswept, they're sun-drenched, they're sources of energy, and we can capture those, as I mentioned before, and we can be the energy superpower of the 21st century. So I would talk about Australia, once again, we're the lucky country.
And Prime Minister Hughes, the other Prime Minister Hughes, the Terry Hughes government of Australia, what would that look like?
That's easy. I would appoint Simon as the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Because at the moment we have a Minister for Emissions Increase. So there you go. You're Minister.
What's my portfolio? No, you don't have to answer that. We're getting some really good questions coming through. Now I've got one here and a lot of that anonymous person is asking a lot of questions, I must say. Anonymous has asked, great research and communications on impacts of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef. The public still deny climate change. How should we change engagement or science communication models going forward? Who would like to? Leslie.
Start with that one?
Yeah.
Well, I will question the premise of the question because the public, as such, is not a single voice, and in fact, the hardcore denialists, even though they're loud, and a disproportionate number of them are unfortunately in government at the moment, they're actually a very small portion of the Australian community. About 6 to 7% are the hardcore denialists. I think and virtually every poll that's done these days, and there are yearly ones done by the Lowy Institute, for example, to look at attitudes towards climate change, and they go up every year in terms of the level of concern. And I would suggest that now, after the several towns in New South Wales that are about to run out of water, and we've just had unseasonal bushfires, if you did that poll today, you'd get an even higher level of concern than even 3 months ago. So I think our challenge as communicators is not to talk to denialists. I don't talk to denialists, I really can't be bothered, I mean, honestly. Our challenge is to motivate those that are concerned to actually do something. And that is a huge portion of the population. They're concerned, but they don't often know what to do or how to do it. So I think that is our public communication challenge, not talking to denialists. I know Terry and some in the audience had some experience with some denialists in Parliament House yesterday, and you didn't get very far, and you probably wouldn't have expected to. Let's talk to people that are concerned, that do accept the science, and help them make a difference.
I'll tease out a little bit of that question. Actually, I'll get to you in a moment, Joëlle, but it's, should we change engagement science communication models going forward? I wonder sometimes whether one example would be the Act on Facts campaign of the wind sector. I'd argue that the trouble with humans is we don't act on facts. Are we trying to appeal to people's heads when we should be appealing to their hearts? Does that, Joëlle, did you have something else to say, or shall I continue on that theme?
You can go on that. I'll hold my comment.
You'll hold your comment. Okay. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Like, do you think we need to rethink the people don't understand enough, the information deficit model of behaviour change?
Well, actually, I will jump in, actually. If you think about a medical analogy, and you need to, say, get a heart operation, do you have to become a cardiologist to understand that there's a problem? You're probably going to trust the experts and take their advice and follow their judgment on that. So while I do think scientific literacy is extremely important, it's not necessary that you need to become a climate scientist to engage in this topic. I think that's important, because I often find that sometimes this conversation gets hijacked by people who like to misconstrue the science and twist it around, but really that's not helpful. So personally, I would like to see a bit more of a sophisticated national conversation going on about climate change. And so that was a bit of a motivator for my book. So really thinking about what have these natural cycles been like in Australia for thousands of years, and how are they now changing because we've introduced human activity into the system. And so it's understanding that natural variability has always been with us and always will be with us, but as we continue to warm the planet, that will change the degree of natural variability that we actually experience. So it's understanding some of those fundamentals, I think, is really important in terms of just that scientific literacy that I talked about before. I think that is really important, but you don't have to be a climate scientist to necessarily engage in this topic. I think that's also really important. And sometimes people can really switch off because they start hearing about electricity prices or things that are a little bit beyond them. So maybe that comes back to your point, Tanya, about, again, that head and the heart. I mean, I think common sense should prevail, and I think most of us would understand that it's just the right thing to do to protect other ecosystems and future generations and keep our planet in a habitable operational zone, if you like. Because beyond 2 degrees, I can tell you from the geologic record, is a completely unstable state. We're talking about a world that's completely transformed then to what we experience right now. So we actually have to think about the reality of these different things. Maybe I'll leave it there.
What's the value of stories? Like one I sometimes tell, because one of the invisible, well, not invisible, but not obvious experiences of increased global averages is warmer evening minimums. So sometimes people might say, well, the news is saying last summer was the hottest on record, but it wasn't. There weren't that many days over 40. But what they've forgotten is that the number of nights that were really, really hot were low. And so I'll often say to people, remember that run of nights where it never got below 25 degrees? Do you remember how grumpy you were the next day? Did you know that crime rates increase when it's hotter and when people are sleep deprived? do you want it to be like that all the time, like more than just those few days and you just survive it and then a cool change comes? And so some of those stories, like they can be quite powerful, can't they? Yes, Leslie.
Coming back to the communication issue, I mean, and I'll say this as a scientist, but we actually don't need any more science, you know. I mean, we'll always want to do more, but we actually don't really need any more. I think we've made the point. I think what we need to actually communicate is ways of making behavioural and economic change easier. Because there'll be people like us and most of you in the audience who will do the right thing for the climate anyway, regardless of how much it costs and et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole lot of people out there that would probably do it if we made it easier for them. So I often use the analogy that Corey Bernardi, and you know, you all know who he is, he's got solar panels on his roof apparently, and I think he's got about the same number of solar panels as I have. So me and Corey Bernardi are having the same impact on the atmosphere with our solar panels as each other. Now we're doing it for probably, I would say, entirely different reasons, but the impact on the atmosphere is the same. And I think we have to really focus on that. What is the impact on the atmosphere of everything that's done? It doesn't really matter why people do things as far as the atmosphere is concerned. It matters what they do. And we actually have to make it easier for people and hopefully cheaper for people to do the right thing, and then good will flow from that. What people think isn't really the point anymore, I think.
There's quite a poignant question that's come from Adrian Riddle. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that properly, but she's asked, government is now considering new coal mines. How can we remain positive and be effective in the face of this?
Yeah, it's a tough question. One thing that's I think that I get positivity from is that we won't see any new coal power plants built in Australia, and there are real. That's not being driven by government policy. That's being driven by economics, and those economics are starting to be felt at different degrees in other countries around the world. So while approvals keep coming one after the other, the ultimate demand for coal, the fundamentals are all in place for that to collapse and the collapse to accelerate. We're not quite there yet. We are in some countries, but we're seeing massive rates of installation of solar in India. We're seeing Japan start talking about reducing their coal consumption. We're going. Approving the mines is one thing, burning it is a different thing, and burning it is making a lot less sense economically.
Actually, Adrian's had a follow-on question that's related. The pipeline of renewable projects is falling as the government's renewable energy target is not renewed. Do you think we can do what's needed in time?
Yeah, it's interesting. The pipeline of committed projects has. Normally we know what's happening next year and the year after, and it's increasing. The next couple of years, there's just not that enthusiasm in the market as the government hasn't extended the renewable energy target. Victoria's renewable energy target continues. We've got a lot of companies in Australia are writing their own power purchase agreements with renewable energy companies. A statistic I heard today is we've got about 100 gigawatts of projects in the development pipeline, not about to build, but people developing projects, getting them ready to build, about 100 gigawatts. That's twice all of the power, the entire power system in Australia right now is about 50. So twice what we've got ahead is going through the development stages. Economics. At the moment, we're just replacing coal plants that are falling over. It's a transition, but it's not fast enough. We need to push it harder, and hopefully the states will deliver the leadership on that over the next few years.
Do you think there's value? Like we tend to think that, I think possibly for a lot of people in the room, the day after the election was probably not the morning that they bounced out of bed with a huge amount of energy. Am I safe in assuming that? So, and then we have to wait another 3 years for another election. democracy is 365 days a year, isn't it? Is there a value in us writing to our local members, communicating with MPs, both at state and federal level? How important do you think that participation in the workings of government is outside of, given that we're still, 2.5 years away from another federal election? Any thoughts, anyone? Yeah.
I think it's important, but it's not the only thing. I mean, I think as some of Simon's examples have indicated, government is becoming, in this sense, increasingly irrelevant. As people do the right thing and as businesses follow the economics, it doesn't matter if Angus Taylor says we're going to build a new coal-fired power station. If none of the banks will lend them money, and if civil society mobilises in the way they have around Adani, and all of those things happen, then I don't believe it's going to be built either. So I think as we go forward, I think the community and business are really leaving the government, the federal government, behind. And even though that's what we seem to focus on because that's what the media focuses on, there's this whole undercurrent of activity that's happening anyway, despite government.
Do you think people are starting to see that this is an argument over what's the smart thing to do rather than we do this because it's the right thing to do? Do you think that's getting through?
Can I want to just quickly talk about engaging with the politicians on it, and see if I can come around to your question. A great mind in Australia, Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, told me something a few years ago. He said, engaging with politicians, you've got to remember there's only two things that change a politician's behaviour. There's pain and fear of pain. Incredibly cynical, but sending letters or going and sitting with your MP and trying to explain to them why they're wrong makes absolutely zero difference. But if you can make them feel that their pre-selection is threatened or that their or their electoral chances next time are threatened, then you can get some action. But and that needs you need to be really strategic to do that. But if just a couple of things that everyone can do. If you have access to a north-facing roof and you don't have solar panels, you're already throwing money away. Put solar on your house and try to get everyone you know who's be one of the 2.2 million households in Australia that do have solar on their roof. And a lot of people haven't thought enough about their superannuation. Check that your superannuation is in a fund that has sensible climate policy. If you can get to why not move to a fossil-free superannuation fund? Check that your money is not working against you and what you want. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
That's a really good point. There's actually Robin King is a lung cancer oncologist who started something called tobacco-free portfolios because she was horrified to realise that she, as a lung cancer oncologist, her super was investing in the product that creates patients for her, and she was horrified. So a lot of people say, I don't have the funds for ethical investment. If you have a superannuation fund, you're an investor. So that's many of us. And if you have a mortgage, you can make choices about your lender and what they're investing in and not. Sam has a question here, which I've been thinking about since Joëlle made her first presentation. The media plays an important role in shaping perceptions. How do we enable the public to be critical of the information they read online or in the paper? And I think we can broaden that to how do we work with the media. Joëlle, the reason why I mentioned you and the things you were saying was the discussion around the media reporting natural disasters. I get infuriated when journalists, not ones like me, but when journalists ask the question, was this, hurricane, stormwater, heatwave, bushfire, was this caused by climate change? And I just want to say, that's the wrong question. So, is it exacerbated by climate change? Comments on the media. Yeah.
So I guess just on the point of, is it caused by climate change? Well, actually, there's a field of science called detection attribution. And now we can run climate model simulations that just use natural factors, so things like solar variability or ocean currents and things like that. And then we can also run the same simulations, but also factoring in human influences on the climate system. And then you can start to look at the probabilities of these types of extreme events playing out with just natural variability and just looking at a system that has the whole anthropogenic elements in there as well. So for instance, with the 2016 Great Barrier Reef bleaching, that event was made 175 times more likely because of the human interference in the climate system. So I think it's a bit of an outdated philosophy, if you like, that there are connections between these extreme events, but it does take time to actually conduct these studies. And it's easier to do with things like temperature because the influences on temperature are a little bit more straightforward than things like rainfall. So right now there's a bit of commentary going on about the drought, but we know that the drought is also being influenced by increasing temperatures. And we know that there's a human fingerprint on Australian temperatures since 1950. So that when you have increased temperatures, you increase evaporation, that exacerbates soil moisture conditions, and we have a flow-on effect of droughts becoming hotter, lasting longer, and having major impacts. So that's just on that point, because I think it's a bit of an outdated idea that we don't know anything about individual events, where I actually think the science has come along in about the last decade or so. But secondly, I personally these days, and maybe Leslie and others on the panel are the same, pretty much every week I'm speaking to a journalist about my field, and sometimes I will spend 40 minutes on the phone. This year I was talking to someone from the Australian Women's Weekly, and then a couple of days later I'm talking to someone from the New York Times. And if they want to ask me in-depth questions, I will absolutely give them my time to try and explain it as much as possible, because I think it's a really important collaboration between the scientific community and journalists to try and get that information out there. But bit of a shameless plug here, but also I wrote a book because I feel like I am actually saying the same thing many times, and I think that just some of the fundamentals are actually in there. So it really helps us have that baseline literacy about Australian climate, which I think is really important. So in fairness, there have been some terrific journalists that I've developed good relationships with, but I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to the not so terrific relationships.
Yeah, if I could chip in here. I think everyone on this panel has been very vocal about climate change issues. That's why we're here, right? And certainly my colleagues in the coral reef realm, we were shocked by the severity of the impact of the back-to-back bleaching on the barrier reef, and it motivated many of us to be much more vocal than we have traditionally been. This is an important shift to a national icon, and people need to know about it. So I think scientists have a role, indeed, I would say it's a civic duty to make their information public. We can contribute information to the public debate. It's up to the public to do with that information what they want. But you can't argue about climate change from a point of ignorance, so at least we can provide information. And certainly, speaking personally, that bleaching event changed my life because of the public interest in it from the media. And we had to devise new strategies to communicate, to meet that. In a sense, it was a demand for information. In Australia, unfortunately, we're lumbered with a very large section of the media that is anti-science and denies climate. And I'm talking, of course, about the Murdoch press. So one positive step you could all take is to never buy the Australian newspaper ever again, because it's just a piece of propaganda.
And conversely, support The Guardian, some of the other independent, The Conversation, yes, those other news organisations that do prefer a bit of evidence-based reporting. But I have slightly hijacked Sam's question there, because originally Sam was asking about enabling the public to be critical of the information they read online or in the paper. Any thoughts on that?
It's just understanding where your information comes from. So as a scientist, we are bound to certain codes of ethics, if you like, around what constitutes information. That means we undergo rigorous peer review, and we're not making things up. It's all evidence-based, whereas somebody who's blogging or isn't an expert in the field, they're not under the same constraints as we are as scientists. And so it takes us a lot longer to come out and say with certainty X, Y, or Z, right? But it's very easy to quickly, rattle off a blog post. But it's not the same weighting. So you need to understand who is actually creating that information and what is it a part of in terms of the institutions. And the scientific field has been around, for centuries. So I think it's just understanding that we're bound to certain levels of quality.
Simon.
One thing I do is when I try to read I try to read. I never pay for the Murdochpedia, but I read it frequently. And when I find abject falsehoods or errors, quickly rattle off a fact check on social media. And what I find that people are really hungry for that kind of information. I think we all know we're being lied to, but a lot of people don't know how we're being lied to, and they really want help with that. So if you have some expertise and you're seeing it misrepresented in the media, get on social media and get some influencers to retweet or repost what you've done. People are hungry for it, and talking about the weighting of a random blog post versus a peer-reviewed article in a major high-impact journal. Try helping to explain to the public the difference between the relative weights there, and when someone posts some Andrew Bolt quote and it's complete rubbish, help the public to see that this is a minority, unsupported opinion. Help people understand. People know, as I said, people know they're being lied to. Help them work out how.
And I think again, the conversation is a terrific initiative where it's basically opinion pieces, or not opinion pieces, but I guess op-eds, if you like.
Really,
yeah, op-eds, but written by experts in the field. So you can get really in-depth commentary by people who are on the front line of these issues, rather than it being written by a journalist who's doing their very best to understand. But if it's actually written by an expert, then I think that it provides a huge resource. I often go there when I'm wanting to understand something, say, about climate policy, which isn't my core business, but is related. So I would recommend, if you don't read it, having a look at it. So it's online and it's written by academics in an accessible way.
Any researchers in the audience here who've written for the conversation before? A few hands there. Good on you. Anyone contemplating it in the future? Hasn't tried? I'd encourage you to, partly because the portal that they use helps you to, you work with an editor and it helps you to translate into lay language. So there's an online editor that does a traffic light system. If it's not easily readable, you'll get a red light or an orange light and it won't publish until you get a green light. If you use too many words of multiple syllables, sentences are 18 words long and longer, it'll tell you, and it's actually a really useful exercise for just plain language statements anyway. Plus, because everything there is published on a Creative Commons license, other publications can pick it up and publish it elsewhere. So potentially you're not just reaching the audience that comes to the conversation website. It's been republished everywhere from the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, ABC. My one piece I've done for them, for the little bit of research I did, which was looking at the pro-environmental attitudes of new mothers, it got published on Essential Kids, which for my target audience was fantastic. I was really happy about that. So do keep that in mind. Getting back to what Sam was asking about media literacy, I'll mention too that ABC had a media literacy week that had some tools for educators. have you noticed this? I've noticed that it is coming up through the education system that children are being taught to question what they read online, but unfortunately we have an older generation that are they're used to a time when everything that was published was fact-checked and books were commissioned and took months and months to be published. Is that your experience, that it might be a generational change?
I think the fact-checking thing is really important. I mean, to come back to Simon's point, and I'll just give an example recently. So after the PM gave his New York summit speech, about how marvellously Australia was doing on climate policy, and I'll put in a plug for the Climate Council, we thought, oh, you know, we're just fed up with this. So Amanda Mackenzie, who's the CEO, did a press conference and said, this is colossal bullshit, and then went through and fact-checked the whole thing. That then became a story because it was sort of more graphic language than perhaps had ever been used by that person in that context before. We even made it onto Media Watch, who then, because then the Prime Minister came back and said, oh, the media's exaggerating, etc. So then Media Watch picked it up and the story kept rolling. So, and then the ABC did a fact check using our media release, and some others did, the Herald did a fact check also using our media release. So I think, you know, a well-placed, well-targeted pushback that actually makes people sit up and take notice. You know, we actually got a bigger run with the fact checking and the bullshit remark than the Prime Minister had got with the speech in the first place. So you don't want to do it every day because people get too used to it. But I think being kind of clever about it. Oh, sorry, Simon, you do it every day. Yeah. Keep it up.
Well,
keep
the
it up.
Climate
Very good.
Council.
I think you've got to be clever about how you do it. But I think sometimes a well-targeted pushback actually, hopefully, gets you a bit further forward.
You know, I think Leslie's just described the climate change communication version of the judo flip, where you take your opponent's energy and convert it into, use their energy against them. I think that's quite good. I've got one more question that I'll ask that's been submitted by the audience, and then we'll have a chance for final pearls of wisdom from our speakers. So, from Chip Young says, loving the panel's thoughts so far. What's the biggest myth that politicians spread about climate change that you'd like to address?
Target at a canter when they're going up.
Now there was one, Joëlle, we were talking about the other day that...
Yeah, so Australia contributes 1.3%
Yes.
of emissions.
Which then it doesn't matter. So
it doesn't matter, right? So, but if you actually add up all the countries that emit, 2% or less, that adds up to 40%. And so it's about being, a good global citizen and actually pulling our weight. So I think that's really important because people think, oh, well, it doesn't matter. But we're actually one of the highest per capita emitters in the world as well.
And if I could follow on from that, not only are we one of the highest per capita, if we only talk about emissions at home, yes, it's 1.5%. Doesn't sound like very much. If we actually say things to the public like we're the 15th highest emitter and there are 180 countries that emit less than we do, that creates a different emotion. And if we then say, actually, we're the second largest exporter of fossil fuels on the planet, that means we are a very big player. What Australia does, not just at home, but what we ship offshore, makes an enormous difference. So we actually need to take responsibility.
So I think it was last year the Business Council of Australia said that the 45% emissions reduction target would be like a wrecking ball to the economy. I would love to smash through that myth. As I said before, in a carbon-constrained world, Australia is once again the lucky country. We've got to stop thinking of this as being afraid that it'll be a wrecking ball to the economy and start thinking that this is it's now time for us to take advantage of the greatest gift that we've ever had, these resources that we have where we can be a global clean energy superpower.
Off the top of your head, do you happen to know how many jobs there are in renewable energy compared with coal mining?
Yeah, actually I presented on that today. So so for the solar industry is about 7,500 installers around the country, and the large-scale solar, there's about 20,000 people that are currently working in installing that. In the coal sector, people often just lump it all together, but we've actually got the thermal coal sector and metallurgical coal. Thermal coal is used to generate electricity. Metallurgical coal is used mainly for steel production.
Thermal coal.
It's
the one where...
Thermal we're burning for power, metallurgical for steel. And I think together it's about 30 to 40,000 in those. So renewables are not, so in total between those two types of coal. But you can already say that there are more Australians that work in renewables than work in thermal coal. And I think one of the most significant things that doesn't get talked about enough is that there are far more Australians whose livelihood depends on the barrier reef than there are in the coal sector. And let's hope there always are.
So jobs and growth, go renewable, go low carbon. Oh, and the other one that I'd tell politicians is, getting back to the earlier point about Australia's tiny, tiny contribution, so small it doesn't matter, the one that I'd hand back to politicians is, well, you know, my proportion of income tax that I pay is only 2% of Australia's total budget. So I just won't bother paying tax because it's not going to make that much difference. I've never had a politician who thought that sounded like a good idea.
Let's say on that 1.3% argument, when the Anzacs went off to World War I, they represented about 1.5%. So Australia was about 1.5% of the British Empire by population. It's never been Australian culture to say, we're too small to make a difference, we'll do nothing. If we came home from the Olympics with only 1.5% of or 1.3% of the medals, we'd be really, really upset. We as Australians, we always like punching above our weight. And when it comes to being a global energy superpower, let's grab more than 1.3%. Let's grab 10% or 20% of the global energy system.
This guy, he's brought in sport and Olympics and Anzacs. Give him a medal. Well, that's all we've got time for now, but I wanted to give each of the panellists an opportunity to just give us, one final thought, one final pearl of wisdom to take home with us as we go on our way. Look, let's just start with you, Terry. Give you first go.
Well, I guess going back to the point around communication, I think it's really important to give people some optimism and some pathways forward. So as a scientist who's an amateur communicator, I always try and get the balance between telling people about the severity of the changes that are happening to places like the Great Barrier Reef, but also pointing out that it's a glass half full, glass half empty, and if we do nothing, it will get a lot worse. And the stuff we can do, listen to people like Simon, and we really need to look for a pathway forward. There's I think an emerging narrative from the Australian government that it's less of their responsibility and more of ours. So there's things cropping up in the barrier reef space, like people are being told their sunscreen is a big threat, or they shouldn't use plastic straws. Well, after 35 years of diving in the Great Barrier Reef, I've yet to see my first plastic straw underwater. So it's not just people and our personal footprints and all of that. There's a huge role for governments to play, and probably the best thing we can all do as individuals is vote and put pressure on the government to come up with better policies.
And on that front, a little bit of what I took as good news is that Canada's elections weren't won by the party who wanted to withdraw Canada from international climate change agreements. So I took a certain level of comfort from that. Yeah. Joëlle?
Yeah, I think just really recognising that this is a really pivotal moment in human history. Make no mistake, it really counts what happens right now. And I think that we do have a lot of power as individuals, and it's just thinking about what side of history you want to be on and just using your sphere of influence to do what you can and what feels authentic for you and what you're capable of doing. But it's understanding that this social tipping point is actually happening. It's happening all over the world, and I think it's going to be unstoppable. It is unstoppable. And it's just a matter of our politicians just getting with the program. But there's a lot of momentum out there that's building, and I think we need to remember that when things do look really grim. But I do think there is actually still some hope.
Thanks, Joëlle. And I'm going to add to Joëlle another final pearl of wisdom from her, because she's too humble to do it. Buy 2 of these when you finish. Buy one for yourself, and Christmas is around the corner. Buy another one for your grumpy uncle for Christmas. So they'll be in the foyer afterwards. Thanks, Joëlle. Simon?
I'd like to leave people with the idea that the energy transition is underway. It's not, as my slide said, it's not a matter of if we're going to transition or when we're going to transition. The transition's already begun. It's accelerating. It's not going as fast as the science demands. So it's moving in the right direction. It's accelerating, but it's not as fast as we need. Now, we don't have, we're not short on the science. We're not short on information. We're not even short on technology. We've got all the technology to do the lion's share. It's a human problem, a people problem, a political problem that we've got to solve. What you can do, I said before, the solar panels and super. Get an electric vehicle as soon as you can afford it, and that's sooner than most people think. That's going to be the next really big thing. And yes, get engaged, vote, and work out how you can put pressure on politicians to make the right decision. Think about that framework of how they, there's pain and fear of pain, and the ways you get them to change their mind.
Thanks, Simon. And Leslie?
I think it's really easy to get depressed, especially when you work in this stuff pretty much full time, like some of us do. I think I'd like to echo some things that Terry and Joëlle said about hope. We have to have hope. Hope. We think of hope as an emotion. I think we have to think of hope as a strategy, because if we don't have hope, then we give up, and if we give up, we are completely screwed. We have to go on and go forward as if there is a positive future, because without doing that, there won't be one.
Thank you, Leslie. And I'm going to recycle one of the comments that I think it was either Leslie or Joëlle as my final pearl. We had sort of conversations in the lead up to this, going over what they talk about. And I think it was you, Leslie, saying that the thought I want to leave with you is the idea that the best thing about anthropogenic climate change is that it's anthropogenic, that this is something that humans had the ability to influence and make happen. And an extension of that is that, humans, our ingenuity, our social systems, our belief in cooperating, that when we're thinking the right way and using evidence, that anthropogenic means that humans have the ability to do something about this problem. It's not something that's out of our hands, like, the moon, his gravity pulls the tides. It's not something like that we're up against. So I think there's that, my final thought is that recognition that we've heard a lot tonight and a lot earlier today about the way that we've seen the human fingerprint on the changes that we're seeing in the natural environment, and it can make you feel kind of a bit ashamed on behalf of, humanity. But I think one thing that we can all commit to doing is seeing what we can do in our own lives to make a difference. And my final thought is to encourage you all to, from now on, see if you can change the world in a way that makes you proud. Thank you for joining us here tonight. Thank you to the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies for hosting. And please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Joëlle, Terry, Leslie and Simon, and thank you.